Welcome to the special meeting of the Joint City Council and Planning Commission study session to discuss the city's housing element. Tonight is Wednesday, June 9th, and it is 6 o'clock. Karen, could you please do a roll call?
Councilmember Donaldson?
Here.
Councilmember Shirley?
Here.
Councilmember Gagliotti? Vice Mayor Lintel?
Here.
Mayor Kerr?
And will you do a roll call for the Planning Commission also?
I will. Planning Commissioner Ragsdale Cronin?
Here.
Planning Commissioner Hayworth?
Here.
Planning Commissioner Jackshaw?
Here.
Planning Commissioner Berger?
He just
Here.
Okay.
Planning Commissioner Krieger?
Here.
Chairman Howlick? Oh, and Planning Commissioner Denise Wood.
So no how, oh, Jeremy's here. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, let's stand and do the Pledge of Allegiance. Jeremy, could you lead us, please?
Certainly. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Before we go on to public comments, I just want to say muchas gracias para la gente en español. So we have the very first agenda in Spanish. So thank you. I guess it was that Randy, Karen, Jeff?
It was per the instruction for the housing element.
Great.
Yes,
All
yes,
right.
but we got it done.
All right.
It was a group effort.
I would also like to point out and say a very special thanks to our newest reserve officer, Officer Yaneli Cuevas. She's here and she will be translating for us should the need arise during public comment or any questions. So she did it on short notice, and
She did.
I just want to make it known that we all appreciate her efforts.
Yeah, Nellie, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's go out to public comments before we get into everything. Anyone wishing to address the commission on matters not appearing on the agenda may do so now. The public may comment on any other matter listed on the agenda at the time the matter is being considered by the council and commission. There will be a time limit of no more than 3 minutes per speaker. No action will be taken by the commission or the council on matters brought up, and all comments will be referred to staff. So I am seeing Mr. Krieger.
Yeah. Hello, Mayor, Council, Planning Commissioners. I just wanted to take advantage of all of us being here together. Just to let you know that the sign committee, subcommittee, I guess actually, sign ordinance subcommittee is has finished our work, and the updated proposed sign ordinance is back with the city attorney, who I believe is sent it to a specialist in these types of ordinances to be reviewed. And so hopefully in a month or so, maybe the next council meeting, probably not this month, we'll bring that before the council for your review. We appreciate your patience. We jumped on and got started right away, but then after we got started, we realized the way we had constituted it was there were some Brown Act issues we had to deal with. So we lost some time with that, and then we got going again. Then we had the election, and because of the results of the election, we had to reconstitute it again. And so we've hit a couple little speed bumps along the way, but it is done. And I just want to let you know that hopefully you'll get a chance to be reviewing that soon. And I just want to thank everybody for their support, particularly the staff who came to the special meetings that was far outside the normal course of duties. And we really appreciate them always having to show up to support us while we were doing it. So thank you. And that's all I got.
Thank you. Any other public comments? I'm not seeing any virtual or physical raised hands. So without further ado, we're going to go on to our presentation by staff, which is an overview of the city's housing element update, including the regional housing needs assessment or RHNA numbers, available sites inventory, impact of recent accessory dwelling unit or ADU law, and review of policies, programs, and schedule for housing element update and related zoning ordinance revisions. At that, I'm going to turn it over to Acting City Manager Hoyne.
Madam Mayor, thank you very much. Council, Commission, residents, and other guests, thank you for attending. I will not go through the entire list that the mayor just read off of what we will cover. You'll see that in the presentations. And those presentations will be done primarily by our city attorney, Alex Lorca, and by our contract planning employee, Denise Duffy from Denise Duffy and Associates, as they are the experts. However, the only thing I'll say, other than introducing them and letting you know that they have put in the hard work on this joint session, this stemmed from, of course, our February 2021 strategic planning session with the elected officials and city executive staff. This was one of the strategic objectives which we were tasked with putting together for council and for the commission to be completed by July. And I would just like to thank Alex, and I would also like to thank Denise for their hard work on this. And we met several times. One of the things that you will see in this is how a lot of things are coming together for our city, whether it's the new ADU restrictions and opportunities that the state has given communities, our housing element, development opportunities, and you'll see where some of these cross. And I think it's a good presentation for our commission and our council and those in our community that want to know how many moving pieces there really are to get our city moving forward and keep us compliant with what we need to do. So again, thank you, and I will turn it over to Alex and Denise, and we'll be available for questions when we're done.
I'm sorry, Alex, before we go any further, may I ask, does anyone need Spanish translation at this time? Okay, thank you, Alex.
Sure. And I think Denise is gonna lead us off here.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Acting City Manager Jeff Hoyne and Mayor. Well, I really greatly appreciate the combined efforts of the city staff to help us get the public outreach out. The Spanish agenda and materials have also been done for our previous housing element, because it's really important that we have an outreach that's robust. I also wanted to thank Karen, particularly, and Randy, because they put out, I think, almost 200 notices to all the different developers, housing coordinators, housing authorities, as many as we could find, to be able to try and find as many people who'd like to come in and comment on the housing element as possible. So for today, Randy, thank you for putting the PowerPoint up on the screen for me. Appreciate it. Today, we're going to go over something that many of you may be familiar with, because we've done this once before. But this is our 2021 housing element update. Next slide. And it's a study session, particularly to be able to combine planning commissioners and council members to be able to give you a background and overview from what you may have already known from our previous process, what really is a housing element, discuss the regional housing needs assessment and how those numbers come about. I'd love to be able to get any input on the update to our available land use inventory as we go through there. Alex will weigh in on accessory dwelling units and particularly talk about the workshop, which is really well attended, that we had for the public workshop on the ADUs and our next steps for bringing that ordinance forward. And then I'd like to go over some of the update requirements from HCD to be able to get into the next round and complete the HCD compliant housing element. And of course, then any questions from the planning commissioners, council, and public, and talk about our next steps. So that's what we're going to talk about. Just go ahead, Randy. I'll have a little title page on each, so you can just jump through that. Thanks. As you know, most of you are aware that housing elements have to identify and analyze the housing needs based upon really reasonable goals, put together objective policies, and based on those needs and set a really focused list of actions. HCD is very, very adamant about having a list of actions that has actionable timeframes. And we did that within the last 2019 timeframe. Then COVID hit, and we may not have met all the action items, but we are now at the spot where it's time to do the 2021 update. It's a policy plan. It's one of the only, it is the only general plan component that actually requires an approval by a state agency, HCD. So basically what we're trying to do is balance the needs of the values of the community and make sure we meet all the legislative goals that are required. Next. It's one of 7 mandated elements of the general plan. Has to be certified by Housing and Community Development Department, and public outreach is a really major component. Even though this isn't housing, this is a housing element update. We do have an adopted housing element that was adopted and have adopted programs, policies, objectives from 2019, December 2019. We still need to do as much as we can for public outreach, and we will also be required to do public review. Those are the critical components. Next slide. So there's some major components of the housing element. We're going to talk about the existing needs, the number of households, who's been overpaying, what are our special needs in the city of Del Rio. Primarily for us, it's the elderly, senior housing, also the issue, not so much as overcrowding, but cost of housing, burden of cost. We need to look at the regional share housing needs and housing needs established by the RHNA. We'll be saying RHNA to account for the name Regional Housing Needs Assessment Plan, which we'll go into. Go ahead. Another, in addition to the housing needs, what we need to look at is a detailed land analysis of really where land is available for us to meet the housing needs. There's a certain number of housing by certain types of housing required levels of affordability. And there's even more specific requirements now this year and for next 6th cycle to identify parcels, existing conditions, where you've got infrastructure, identifying where there are suitable spots to accommodate the housing needs. You don't have to build the housing, but you actually have to identify that we have enough land available that has the capacity to address the regional housing allocation as well as population growth within there. Next. And, I think it's important to also just provide a little bit of historical overview while we're going through the components, and that is just to let you know this has been an iterative process. However, it's been a long one. The city had a major coup in 2019 by actually adopting the housing element, the first one since 1992 officially. So we were working really closely with HCD. They helped us quite a bit. They were very pleased that we went through this process. We were almost there at the spot, actually, that they had recommended approval, but we weren't able to accomplish that because Alex will, or I can talk to you later about that, but the element that some comments created in 2019 that we tried to negotiate with someone that was going to sue the city over the housing element adoption because of a rezoning included in it. The city had determined to take the rezoning out to try and get the parties not to sue, although that didn't work. So we have now a housing element without the accommodating rezoning, and that's what's really left over to do for this housing element to achieve the compliance. That's a short answer, and Alex can talk to you about all of the above. I think the important part here is there were 7 or 8 public hearings during that period of time. There was a lot of public outreach. There was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mailers and outreach to stakeholders during that process, trying to get input, etc. We had a number of different people coming, and that led to, I think what was a comprehensive housing element. And thanks, go ahead, we're next one. And now we're at 2021 where it's time to update it already. The reason that we're doing the update is to get compliant. The other reason we're doing this update is because we'd rather not have to do every 4 years housing element updates. That's costly to the city. And if we were able to get a compliant housing element into this cycle, then we will now be into an 8-year cycle as opposed to having to update a housing element every 4 years. What's important about that is there's a lot of changes in housing law as they're coming through. So it's important to do that. So the other component of the housing elements, is analyzing constraints. What's causing us not to be able to provide housing in the city? I know our city is mostly built out, but there's also, we're supposed to evaluate land use controls, our fees, permits, processing procedures, and other constraints. Simply put, a lot of our constraints are related to water and infrastructure, and just available land. And then part of the housing element is just development of the programs that remove or mitigate any governmental constraints that we put on housing ourselves, conserve and improve the housing stock, and really promoting fair and equal housing for all of our citizens. Next. So our programs have really, we also discussed, and this is going to be part of the 2021 update, what have we learned, what's the status and implementation of what we've done based upon the last housing element. We also did that in the housing element required annual progress report, which was submitted April 1st, as well as our, and we'll be doing this for that. So it's really what effectiveness the previous element programs have had and how far we've gotten in terms of meeting the objectives. And then we quantify our objectives by income, rehabilitation, and conservation over our planning period. And that's the components, primary components of the housing element. I think it's important to just focus that the programs are quantified. We have to remove or mitigate constraints. We have to identify adequate sites and preserve any at-risk homes, as well as provide for equal opportunities. And then HCD typically reviews that as a draft, early draft, and determines if we're preliminary meeting the state law, and they'll give us early feedback on that. Next slide. This is just a sample program that from our existing housing element that, you know, some of these development of inclusionary housing ordinance accommodate the 5th planning cycle and the 4th cycle carryover, which I'll go over. Next. And here's an example on the next slide of what we did in the last housing element in terms of here's where we identified available land use. And it's important to look at this now because there's going to be a little bit of a shift in this that we're proposing and like your input on that. Well, I'll look at this later, but here's our what's called the available land use inventory. Go ahead, next. And then this is really the RHNA process. This is a slide from AMBAG that that lets us know really RHNA, the Regional Housing Allocation Needs Assessment, and the allocation is really determined first by HCD with very different programs, COGS, Department of Finance. It then reviews that with COG, that's our AMBAG, and basically works with the local governments to come up with what is our actual RHNA distribution cycle. We're about to come into another one starting for the 6th cycle, but currently with the housing element we're talking about is 5th cycle. And there's some background information that's on these next slides. Sandy? So the Regional Housing Needs Assessment distributes the regional housing needs based upon population factors in terms of income, et cetera, I'll get into. And this is just interesting because it gives you the housing and population estimates. You can see that Delray Oaks is at that time population 1665, I think it might be, and of the occupied homes, 701 homes and housing units. In group quarters, not very many. Single detached is a primary type of housing we have, and none that we know of that are mobile homes, but someone may tell us wrong. Tell me separately about that. Go ahead. These are the types of goals that are provided by each county in our Monterey Bay region. You can tell the numbers are really high in terms of the 5th cycle for the total amount of housing needs that need to be met within Monterey County and each of the neighboring counties within AMBAG. Next slide. And in comparison, our numbers are quite different. We actually are at a smaller number in terms of the 4th and the 5th planning cycle. 4th cycle is really a carryover from what's needed within our 4th planning cycle. Since we didn't really complete anything, that gets carried over to the 5th cycle. Next slide. So RHNA is developed by jobs and housing, infrastructure, availability of land, transit is really important, directing growth, Loss of housing, loss of units during an emergency is one of the factors. High housing cost burdens, rate of overcrowding, farm worker housing, which really doesn't impact us, student housing needs, GHG reduction targets, and other factors. And this is what AMBAG's going to be looking at right now as they go through their 6th cycle process. AMBAG is going through that process right now. They're invited and have accepted to come to a meeting coming up in the summertime so they can go over this information with you. And I think that there may be some questions regarding RHNA allocation numbers. If you'd like to have that they're willing to do that. And we've also been tracking that and have a lot of information about it if anyone wants the information. Go ahead. So the objectives are promoting infill, ensuring jobs housing, having income parity, affirmatively for AFFH, affirmatively further fair housing, and increasing housing supply and mix of housing types. And I think that's probably very consistent with the objectives of the city. Next. Again, AMBAG is going to be coming to talk to you about the 6th cycle input into RHNA and the city, and we will be submitting comments on once we get the 6th cycle. But I did want to let you know this is one of the many slides that we have, and they're not really going to be providing any full specifics in terms of each jurisdiction for a couple months now. So not really right to talk too much more about 6th cycle. Go ahead. And then that takes us to the land availability analysis. This is our general plan. It's just part of what we use to identify where housing may be developed and what our existing underlying zoning and general plan is. The next slide, Randy, is just the zoning, similar map, but also it gives you an idea of what's different about our city is that mostly it is built out. And they also have certain constraints associated with the airport and with availability of infrastructure, and actually quite a lot of parkland, which is pretty great. Next slide. So the requirements is really to show that you've got enough land zoned to accommodate the allocation of units from the RHNA. And you have to address how you can meet that, and you have to be very specific. If you say that we have water in a certain area, HCD is very specific with us in particular, and are stating that we need to identify how we think we may be able to accommodate water and provide the infrastructure in areas that may not be known to have water right now. So those are some of the things that are the requirements for Delray Oaks housing element and how we can accommodate our RHNA numbers. Go ahead. We slightly updated the map, so I'm looking for input here. You'll see site 1 is the former Fort Ord. The site 1, 247 acres, is the site that's been considered for development over many years with a developer and an RFP process over the years. And that's not zoned for residential at this time, except for I think 200 acres under 200 units under the redevelopment plan. Site 1A is city owned. Site 1A, also former Fort Ord property, is on the other side of South Boundary Road. And that is 18.5 acres. It goes all the way down the hill. They've got some area of flatland, and it is owned by the city and also is considered to have availability of infrastructure that could be provided to it. Not available now, but could be. Both of those sites were identified by HCD in our 2019 housing element, and they were really focused and directing us to use those sites for the 100% of our RHNA. So those two sites in our housing element update, I'm proposing to leave in per HCD's letter and ensuring that we can get some compliance. There's one site I took out, and it was the former 17-acre site. It's everyone knows where it is. It's the triangular site below Site 1A and crowded, Canyon Delray Boulevard. And it was a marginal site at that time because of the heavy resources there. So I'm looking for input if you think that may not be reasonable. And then I actually replaced that site with the green spot right there, which is the area below the city hall, which is the former RV storage area, public works yard. And that has some potential for, you know, it's considered developed under HCD standards because it has been developed in the past, and also has the potential for some water, as we heard last meeting with Water Management District, which we definitely will be continuing to pursue. And then site number 3 has not changed. It's the city-owned site. It is leased right now to the landscaping business, but it also has areas of tennis courts and areas outside the landscaping business. It may have some availability for sites. And then site 4 was something that we're going to be updating, but we are really thinking that there's some potential for ADUs within this next, to be able to accommodate part of our arena with some ADUs, and Alex will talk about that in the future. Next. So it's just a slide of why we're thinking that it's probably a good idea to take out the 17-acre site. Next. Here's just the previous 2019 land use inventory to get the comparison you've seen before and our rationale behind it. Next. This is the specific site of the parcel that we're adding in the new site to, the former RV storage lot. And I think it has some potential for being able to accommodate, show that there is land available to accommodate affordable housing within our jurisdiction. Next. And this is the area of the APN area of the landscape business, and it does have some potential for it. There's some, I don't think we're really talking about doing anything where the tree lines areas are by the riparian. That's obviously resource oriented, but really talking about if there's a potential to put a few units on either side of the area that's already been impacted. Next slide. And this is the former Florida parcels. That's a tongue twister. Which is the tentative parcel map to give you more specifics. These maps are in the previous housing element as well, our current housing element. Next. This is a specific of how we did the assumption of the number of ADUs that could be available. HCD did not like the way that we said that we could have a number of different ADUs given the criteria that we used. So we're going to be using more information to them. We're going to get more specific, using more current ADU law to be able to say, here's why we think there could be a number of different ADUs that are that can be accommodated in our arena within the city's jurisdiction. And we will update this ADU map by the time the housing element comes back to you as a draft. Next slide. And back up. And now that brings us to the segue to accessory dwelling units, a presentation by Alex. I'll turn this over. It'll just pick up where it left off before Randy when we finish up.
Randy, if you put my slides up, please. All right. Thank you, Randy. Good evening, Mayor, members of the council, members of the commission. I am going to go through accessory dwelling units with you. As you've probably heard, there's been a lot of changes in the last year or so. And it's going to, I think, have a factor and be an important factor in our housing element and some of the options the city has for locating housing to meet RHNA numbers. So an ADU is an accessory dwelling unit. What is it accessory to? It's an accessory to the primary residence on the lot. So I think historically they've been known as granny units, but the term now is accessory dwelling unit. So you have a primary single family residence or even a multifamily residence, and these are sort of either within or separate granny units, if you want to think of it as that. Next slide, please, Randy. So there's different varieties of ADUs. There's detached, where they're separate from the primary structure. They're added on to the primary structure. There are those that convert existing spaces, and that can be within an existing primary residence, master bedroom, attached garage. And then there's a special breed called a junior accessory dwelling unit. And the big difference there is that sort of the sanitation and sink can be shared with the primary residence, whereas with other ADUs, that's not the case. And as well, they're allowed to have an efficiency kitchen, which is sort of microwave, hot plate and coffee maker, that type of thing. So those are your sort of flavors of ADUs. The states provided a lot more detail of what they are and what they can be. Next slide, please. So this slide and the next slide are just sort of refresher concepts, I think, that'll help us understand the state's authority and some of the processing involved in these type of things. A ministerial approval you can think of as sort of an over-the-counter approval. Most people say building permit, technically they can be discretionary, but something like that, where you check all the boxes and Karen at City Hall hands you your permit. On the other hand, a discretionary approval is one that you have to have a hearing for, either in front of a single city employee or something like the Planning Commission. And in those, the hearing officer or the commission exercises discretion. An example might be, in addition to a house, we like this, we don't like that. They can help shape the project, whereas ministerial is really over the counter and just stamp the sheet. Next slide, please, Randy. And the other concept here is preemption. Federal law trumps state law, which trumps local law. So we have federal housing law, we have state housing law, and local law. And you may say to yourself, why is the state elbowing in on our discretion to regulate our fair city here with respect to housing? And the answer is because they can, and because there's a statewide concern with available housing. And so these are just concepts to keep in mind. The city does retain some discretion in ADU law, but not a whole lot, and we'll get into that. Next slide, please. So under the state regulations, the ADUs are available essentially wherever anything could be a residential use. Even if it's in a mixed use zone that's, residential and or light industrial, something like that. If residential is allowed, there the ADUs are allowed. So state preemption there. Some city discretion, cities can permit ADUs in other residential zones. They can limit locations based on very few things, criteria, adequacy of water and sewer service, traffic impacts, and public safety. And the example, of course, is our current CDO. Now there may be we'll talk about the water as it relates to ADUs in a minute, but I just couldn't help but notice that even at the state level, recognizing something like a CDO could keep the units from being built. Next slide, please. So ADUs, we have some discretion to limit their size, but again, the state comes in and tells us, well, for a studio, you can tell folks there's a minimum, but can't below 850 square feet, and 1,000 for an ADU with more than one bedroom. You'll have to forgive me. These slides are probably a bit more detailed than they need to be. They're from the public workshop in which we went to a lot of detail. And I suppose while I'm skipping a beat here, I could also let you know that the ADU ordinance will be drafted after today's study session so that we can take that input. We've had a public workshop already. So again, with maximum square footage, there's no maximums. Junior ADUs do have a little maximum, but really that's a bit of detail there. That's probably beyond the scope of tonight's meeting. Next slide, Randy. Design standards. So a little discretion here in that the city can regulate design standards, but the city has to do so in such a way that Karen at City Hall can look at your application and say, yep, it matches, or no, it doesn't, stamp approved. So while we have some discretion, instead of that discretion being exercised every time an application comes across, it's here's the framework and Karen, go apply it. And she will, and she'll do so. And they've got to be substantially objective is the term there, meaning most people could walk in and, colors and design to match, I think is pretty standard and something that Karen could look at the application, look at the primary residence and make that determination. If they don't meet the criteria, interestingly, they can be approved through a discretionary process. So even if there's not enough there for Karen to stamp it at City Hall, they can always have a hearing in front of the Planning Commission to get the ADU approved. Next slide, Randy. Thank you. Density is another thing that you see, and this is going to be important for ADUs. The ADUs don't count towards density on lots because it's an accessory use to the primary residence there. Some setback requirements, but again, preempted by state. We'll get into that a little bit in the following slides. Next slide, please. Another big concern for residents, at least, is parking. In the past, cities who have discouraged ADUs or in certain residential areas have said, well, what about parking? And you got to have one off-street parking space for each, XYZ square footage. State law says not anymore. There's some wiggle room here, but not a lot. And so there's a lot of preemption here with respect to parking. City can't require more than one parking space per unit or bedroom, whichever is less. So again, parking, whereas maybe in our last housing element update might have been an issue, probably won't be as big an issue this time around. Next slide, Randy, please. More parking. Randy, if you'll just go again, this is probably a little bit more detailed there. So this is another big one, and you've seen a lot of jurisdictions say, well, if you have a second unit, the owner's got to occupy one of them. And the idea being that there should be someone vested with a vested interest on the property. So pursuant to state law, until January 1 of 2025, that's no longer permissible. However, should a property have both an ADU and junior ADU, the owner must occupy either the JADU or the primary residence. That's one carve out. Next slide. Pardon me. So the city can require the ADUs to be rented for longer than 30 days. One of the things we did here very clearly at the public workshop was, because this is meant for housing, for long-term housing, let's not allow short-term rental of the ADUs, which I think makes sense. So you'll see most jurisdictions are prohibiting short-term rental of ADUs. Next slide, please. So there's a variety of ADU that the state has said, look, if this thing comes across your desk, Karen, as long as it meets building code, you've got to stamp it approved. So even the discretion that we talked about earlier, if they, meet, sort of some of the few things, the objective criteria the city's allowed to impose, you've got to stamp them approved. And quickly, they are one ADU and JADU within an existing single family residence with exterior access. The setbacks have to satisfy fire and safety. So if it's within already an existing structure and the homeowner does some modifications to allow for exterior modifications, it's, as long as the fire department signs off on it and the staircase is safe and the kitchenette is safe and all that kind of stuff, that is just going to be a building permit, not even an ADU permit. The next one is a detached new construction ADU that does not exceed 4-foot side and rear setbacks. And the city can require a limit of 800 square feet and a height of 16 feet. So this is just a detached little ADU. Side and rear setbacks are met. And that's what they call statewide ADU. Next slide, please. So now we look at multifamily, which I don't think the city has multifamily. I may be wrong, but if they do, it's not a lot. So multiple ADUs within portions of existing multifamily dwellings that are not used as living space, garages, attics, basements. The city's got to allow at least one ADU within the multifamily dwelling and allow up to 25% of the multifamily dwelling units. And the other one is 2 ADUs located in a lot that has an existing multifamily dwelling, but are detached from that multifamily dwelling, apartment complex, fourplex, that type of thing. Next slide, Randy, please. So whether or not the city wanted to allow short-term rentals or not, these sort of quote statewide ADUs under subdivision E are prohibited from being rented short-term. And the design standards appear not to apply to ADUs and JADUs that are approved under the subdivision E, the statewide ADU. Next slide, Randy. Thank you. So I think very important for tonight, of course, is the fact that HCD, the Department of Housing and Community Development, has stated ADUs count towards the city's regional housing needs allocation, our RHNA numbers. So, you know, if you have the sites available, that now I think will be a big part of what we bring to you with the housing element update. I don't know that there's any, well, the Oaks may have CCNRs, but HOAs can't prohibit ADUs in their development. Again, statewide preemption. So you could have CCNRs recorded that say no granny units, and that's now void under state law. And the nice thing, I suppose, is that HCD will review our ADU ordinance after its adoption and sort of give it their stamp of approval, which is great. And if they have a tweak, we'll just bring it back to council. But certainly we will work with them beforehand to know that they will give it their stamp of approval. Next slide, please. So more good news for the ADU. It's exempt from CEQA. Again, the state coming in and saying this is so important that even though potentially now we have, you know, each single family residence and each R1 parcels could be a triplex. CEQA, there's an exemption from that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, with the statewide ADUs, all ADUs have to comply with the building code. So that's, you know, sort of health safety type stuff. Next slide, or is that? Oh, okay, so city process for the approval. I think we talked about this a little bit, similar to a building permit in which they're submitted and the Water Management District approves, the building permit is issued. It's treated similarly to other remodels in the city. And for ADUs to be approved ministerially, the city has to adopt sufficiently objective standards to allow for ministerial review, which we talked about earlier. What is the criteria? Is it clear? And can Karen very easily approve them as they're submitted? Next slide, please. So the Water Management District, I know water's on our mind. My understanding for the Water Management District is that water can be used for ADUs. If they're new construction ADUs, you need a water meter. And if the ADU includes new water fixtures, the way to get the ADU approved is to put in efficient units and essentially transfer those credits to the ADU used. So that satisfies, you know, if you're using the same meter, the moratorium on new hookups, cease and desist, that's the way to get there. So the Water Management District has found a way to do that. So I think, you know, the existing built out portions of the city are served by the Water Management District. So there's a path forward there as long as folks have the ability to bank water credits and upgrade their fixtures. Next slide, Randy, is that, or is that it? Looks like that's it. And Madam Mayor, as I mentioned, we had the public workshop on this, robust discussion, and we will be bringing the ordinance to the Planning Commission probably in July, and from there to the City Council. So it's very highly tied to the housing element, but it's something that will operate independently of the housing element adoption.
Thank you.
So thank you, Alex. So to proceed, with your permission, Mayor,
Yeah, please.
to finish the presentation here, next slide, Randy. We're going to talk just a little bit about the policies and programs. As Alex just mentioned, it is the ADU ordinance is directly tied to the housing element, even though it's you know, it's also required under state law, because we have a specific program and an objective to update what we had. The city had an accessory dwelling unit ordinance. So the policy program is to update the ADU ordinance to existing standards and to be compliant with state regulations. And that was an adopted policy program with an accepted, even if anyone were to challenge it, it's not subject to CEQA, but it's already covered under the existing housing element. So that's, we'll be proceeding directly. As Alex noted, we've been working to update the municipal code over the last year. We've gotten I think every single ADU ordinance we can find locally and generally, and talked to different city attorneys and et cetera. And there's also an HCD ordinance on an ordinance on HCD's website too. So all that has been turned over to Alex. We're just waiting, and we had the workshop, so we're waiting to put an ordinance together, and as Alex said, bring it before you in July. I think it's good timing. Next slide. So here's another example of a policy program that's on regarding an ordinance. Program D4 commits to allowing emergency shelters by right. We're working to update the city's municipal code for the ordinance to permit their emergency transitional supportive housing as required under state law in their appropriate zoning districts. And that is something that we're also working with Alex on. He will bring it back for you. But again, it is specifically already within the policy and program of your adopted current city zoning ordinance. Next slide, Randy. Here's just an example startup of, we've gotten a whole ordinance, but this section establishes standards for daily operation in the general commercial zone, and it's in compliance with SB2. So this is something that is also exempt from CEQA. Next slide. So we are still working on what we need to do to comply with ARENA, and one of those elements is understanding if we have enough sites available for the accommodating our ARENA. At this point, HCD and we do not think that we have enough sites within our existing city without the, even with, well, we have to do the numbers, but if we were to be able to convince Water Management District that we can use the site under the former RV site and the sites for ADUs, they would probably not give us more than up to 10 ADUs, given their history of ADU creation. That's what we've been talking about to them in the past. So, you know, we still have a little bit of a shortfall. And if we don't have enough available area, we are required to, and we also don't really have enough available area within or outside, within the current city limits, not former Fort Ord, and we don't have enough sites that are zoned residential within the former Fort Ord site. So we just don't have a lot of residentially zoned property. ADUs will provide some, but of the shortfall, we still would need to do some rezoning. And that's exactly what the housing law requires. You have to go to steps to provide enough density to rezone the properties for residential to meet RENA. That's really where we are. What HCD said last time, next slide, in 2019 is we had a program to accommodate the regional housing needs to rezone site 1A, which you saw before in our presentation, and to allow for moderate and above moderate and 1A and low and moderate, or low and moderate 1A and moderate and above moderate in site 1. So the area south of South Boundary, we had sites available for rezoning, and then we had sites north of South Boundary, on the other side of South Boundary Road. So I think what we're doing right now is we're just looking at our numbers and we're looking for direction from the city. Obviously, if we can use more sites, the better we are. There's more land available that we could use to accommodate our RENA. So I think it's reasonable to be able to state we can use this property. You know, there's some downsides to that too. So we are going to be bringing that back to you. And if you have any comments on that, you know, where do you want to see affordable housing? Please, you know, provide that within your comments. Next slide. Again, this is just the comments that they had on the previous zoning, on the housing element. So our next steps, we can consider any policy additions or revisions at tonight's study session, but it's really not ripe. I just wanted to sort of get you the background. So please take a look at, we'll give you a little sheet of all of the different existing city policies that are adopted now within the city's housing element. Now's the time to take a look at that. We have a number of different policies to talk about ordinance revisions. One of them includes housing, the inclusionary housing ordinance. Does the city want to do an inclusionary housing ordinance at this time? There's a requirement that will be for any developer that does that if the development occurs in former Fort Ord, that has to occur, but that's one question. There's a number of different ordinances that are proposed. density bonus ordinance is also proposed in the housing element policy. So I think the homework for the City Council and Planning Commission is take a look at those, see if there may be some consolidation while we have this opportunity to update the housing element. We're a very small city and there's a lot of actions. And I think what we want to do is work with HCD to get a compliant document, but not overload the city staff on too many elements, too many revisions that we may not be able to make progress on, and really focus on those that can provide the objective improvements and standards and potential to really provide housing in this housing crisis and shortage timeframe. So we will be bringing back we'll consult with HCD staff as we move through this, so we make sure we're working hand in hand with them as we've been continuing to do. The city attorney and we will bring back ordinances for adoption. We will discuss specifically the ADU ones, as we talked about, and the by right housing, emergency shelters, transitional housing. And then our next step is we're going to be bringing back housing elements in draft forms and with policies for probably another workshop, maybe first at the Planning Commission and then at the City Council, and to be able to provide better direction. And also to continue to outreach to the public and ensure that we're getting their comments, questions answered, and have more workshops if that's what's needed. Outreach to stakeholders. Next slide. And this is just our list of things that we're doing and a general time frame of how we're going to bring this back, what things are coming before you, and we're just tracking that with our requirements. And you can see the hearings and the workshops. There's always a lot of them under housing element, and I think that's appropriate. And there have been some too already. So next slide. I think that's it. So we're available for any questions and also any questions from the public. I just wanted to say one thing as you're thinking about your questions and whatnot. We are also working with the city to develop survey questions for our work that we're doing with EPS. And I just brought up some questions if the public's interested, to talk about what do you think the major challenges in the city are for creating housing now and in the future? What types of housing are particularly needed in the community? What strategies would be appropriate for new housing units? For example, mixed use, increased density, reuse of existing buildings. And where these are some of the survey slides too, but where would the single family housing, multifamily housing, where do you think it should be located citywide? Those are just things that we're working on and we want you to think about. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was just going to say, if you guys don't mind, can we start with the council and go through methodically, or do you guys want to raise hands? Let's go through methodically. Ms. Lintel.
Thank you. As usual, your presentation was outstanding, Denise. Thank you so much. I do have a couple of questions. Could you please define emergency shelter for me, please?
Sorry, get off my unmute button here. Sure, that's something that under the city housing element and law, we have been not providing. There's transitional shelter housing that is a requirement under state law that you're allowed to provide, that you're required to provide by right housing, so that the housing of emergency shelters, certain types of housing is available to be provided within certain zones by right, and we're required to put an ordinance together to that effect. And there are certain ordinances and design standards, development standards you can put on there that I'm trying to pull up. But essentially that's under the requirements of state law, and it's consistent with what our last housing element says. It's currently already a program in our housing element. So, requires local entities to have supportive housing be used as a permitted by right in zones, certain zones, and by providing a ministerial approval process as opposed to a discretionary permit. And we can define a little bit of what the emergency housing is, but it's actually also defined in the housing element. So.
Pat, did you have another question?
I do have another one. I'd like to know if these housing units can be occupied by anybody, like a student or a senior citizen, or are there any restrictions?
Are you talking about the ADUs?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Alex?
No, there's no restrictions that I'm aware of.
And those are my two questions.
Okay. Mr. Donaldson?
So just to follow up, the emergency shelter is a facility that houses persons on a short-term basis who are homeless or recovering from violence. Traditional housing defined as temporary housing for individuals who are transitioning to permanent housing. And it's defined by housing with minimal supportive services, limited to occupancy of 6 months or less. It's under SB2.
Okay, so we can't require the housing to be like for our teachers or our fire department or police department?
I think it's sort of two different things. We're talking about the emergency shelter. There are two ordinances very specifically different. The accessory dwelling unit ordinance and ADUs, those are allowed uses for, as Alex just talked about, in terms of adding a unit onto your site. That's a small unit up to 600, 1,200 square feet. The emergency shelter is an ordinance under SB2 that we have to approve, adopt, that is basically shelter for group housing, if you will, for emergency transitional housing. And it's specific to those types of homeless or transitioning people, not necessarily. An ADU is specific. For instance, it's on you have a house, you can put your ADU in your garage or do some method by that. An emergency shelter, which could be created, would be in a commercial zone or a higher density zone, and it would be a more multi-person facility, not a specific home.
Thank you. Thanks again for being here this evening.
Thank you.
Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thanks, Denise. Great presentation. I just have one question, then I have a few comments. My question is about the RHNA numbers. You had mentioned that they're working on our next set of numbers, and it should be a couple of months. But do we have any indication what those numbers are going to look like?
Sorry, I keep muting myself. We do not yet, and it's actually going to be a year process or more. They've started to work on them and pulling that up as well, but it's really, we're going to be talking about it in a few months. They're going to be presenting the numbers, and then we'll be discussing the allocations. The city will have a chance. You personally, as a city council, may be able to have an opportunity to weigh in on what you think the allocation is. The city will make sure that we write a letter with the elements that we consider to be, if the numbers are off, and we think they might be, if they don't consider the fact that we don't have ability to provide water, to provide housing. I think those are really critical elements. And so when they develop the allocation, they develop a system that's one large number that gets divvied up between all the different jurisdictions within both MBAG, all the Tri-County area, and then our Monterey County area and the individual peninsula cities. So we will have an opportunity to take a look at that. Scott, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it kind of does, but from what I understand, it's supposed to increase significantly, and maybe Councilmember Shirley can talk about it later. She's our representative on the AMBAG board, but I'm getting that indication that maybe it's going to go up a lot more than it is right now.
That's absolutely correct. That's everything that we've heard for the last 2 years from HCD directly.
Okay, and I saw on there you had a number of 59. I thought we were at 87.
Yeah, we actually are. I was just pulling that up. That pulled that off a different presentation, but the number that that we have is 86, and I think that 70 number was specific to what we need to do with fourth cycle, fifth cycle, low and very low, because that's with the fourth cycle carryover, we have to provide low and very, very low from the fourth cycle numbers. And so I think that's what that number was, but I'll correct that. Thanks for, I think it's confusing, so.
Okay, no problem. And then I just had a couple of comments that I'd like to share with everybody. And first off, I think it's great that we have the whole council and the planning commission together. I think that's very helpful. In terms of the sites that you presented, I think it's great that we remove 17 acres. I have long believed that there's no way we could put residential units out there. So I like that. I like that that's been done. Adding site 2, which is the public works yard, and site 3, which is down by the garden center, I think personally is problematic. I think we're going to have a very, very tough time with any type of infill of residential units in there. I don't know. That's just my personal thoughts. I think that's going to be very, very difficult. The ADUs, I think it's great that we will be able to add some numbers there, but I also think that is going to be limited. And in terms of the ADUs, I just have a tough time that it can be approved so easily in an over-the-counter type of situation. I guess I understand it because there's ultimately the big need within the state to provide that affordable housing. But I have a tough time with it because, I mean, we've got a situation on Bray, for example, and what the applicant has gone through with that. And it kind of makes me think about people who are remodeling their house. Why do we even put that before the planning commission if somebody could come in with an ADU and just do it over the counter? So I guess there's part of me that's kind of having some difficulty with that. You know, personally, I would like to see at least it have to go to the planning commission and at least something be netted or something be notified to the neighbors to where they understand what's going to be put on the property next to them, for example, so it doesn't create all these issues. Because it definitely impacts the quality of life in the neighborhood. There's no question about it. In terms of rezoning, I think it's very appropriate to rezone Site 1 Alpha. And really that is my preferred site. And for everybody, that's the Port Ord property that's right over the hill from 17 acres. And I think that's very appropriate because I would like to see housing that's a little bit closer to the city itself. I think Site 1 is also appropriate to rezone that for residential. But you know, being so far away from Delray Oaks, I mean, we're already kind of a geographically diverse city. It'll be more like they're part of Laguna Seca as opposed to being part of Delray Oaks. But in both cases, I think it's appropriate to rezone those. And those are kind of my personal comments on that. And that's all I have. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you.
All right. Ms. Shirley.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Denise and Alex, for your presentation tonight. It was a lot to go over, so I appreciate the information. I feel like I need to hear it many times before it sinks in. In terms of, for Councilman Donaldson, I'm actually missing the AMBAG meeting tonight where they're talking about the housing element. I know they're not giving us RHNA numbers tonight. They said they're going to give us those, I think they mentioned in August. So, and I have heard that those are going to significantly go up as well. So, so yeah, that's correct on that. I do have a few questions. This one maybe could be, Alex, you can address this. I know Councilman Donaldson talked about site 2 and 3 as maybe not being appropriate. I'm concerned about those sites simply because of deed restrictions. Do you think, can you address that at all in terms of, I know for site 3, for sure, there's municipal purposes on there. I don't know where affordable housing falls in line with that.
Yeah, it would definitely be a gray area, Council Member Shirley. The deed restrictions could be something that could be problematic. Again, the state law doesn't compel the city to build housing or produce housing. It's all about clearing obstacles, and whether or not a deed restriction on a potential site is sufficient that HCD would look at it and go, well, okay, that one's out. I'd have to research, frankly.
Okay. Okay. So I'd be curious to know that, I guess.
Sure.
And then also, you know, to see if there's any deed restrictions for site 3 too,
Okay.
Or as well. Let's see, some additional questions. Denise, I was curious, do JADUs and regular ADUs, do they count the same amount towards the RHNA numbers?
Great question. Alex, do you know? I think they would.
I don't know that off the top of my head. I mean, I suppose, well, rather than venture a guess, I'll just leave it at that. I'm not sure of the answer to that.
Yeah. I would think that they would, because it's a location for someone to live, and it's
right.
So it's a unit.
Right. Okay. And so then I'm wondering, how do we count our qualifying lots for potentials for ADUs? I mean, those are all lots that the city doesn't own. So so clearly we're able to go in and say, okay, on this privately owned land, theoretically, there could be an ADU there. We don't know if there's water available, right? We don't know. I mean, maybe they already have water efficient, things in their house, and so you wouldn't have any available water credits. How do we judge that?
That's a really great question. So what we did previously, and what we're the last one, and what we're planning to do a little bit more robustly is to get the list of the APNs, assessor parcel numbers within the city, to do by lot size element, juxtapose that over the residential density, and then do what we've done in the past, which is a little bit of a windshield survey to drive around, knowing it's a small city and we can do that relatively easily. And then what we have to do, I think, is be realistic, because we won't get it accepted housing element if we don't, is just identify that because we have the water management district and the CDO, we're going to have assume that there's a percentage of the lots that could develop into or have an ADU or a JDU that would be available because of their older fixtures, and just put an assigned percentage with some solid rationale behind that. And I think with our justification, and then that's generally the methodology. And Alex and I were just talking about that this morning, because we also have to juxtapose over, there's no limited lot size, as he mentioned during his presentation. So,
Councilmember Shirley, if I might go back to the previous question and
Sure.
And to make it as clear as mud, this is from the HCD handbook. Your question of, what does it take for this to count towards one? So it says, to credit a unit towards the RHNA, HCD and the Department of Finance utilize the census definition of a housing unit, generally an ADU and a JADU with shared sanitation facilities, and any other unit that meets the census definition and is reported to the Department of Finances as part of their annual chain survey can be credited towards the RHNA based on the appropriate income level. So at least we have a path where to start our research. But I knew I'd seen something regarding that, and it is in the HCD ADU handbook.
Okay.
And just one thing in terms of us stating that this is going to be the number versus HCD accepting, what we've talked to them about in the past and currently is that they, because we have not had any ADUs up until, when we were going through the 2019 process. They would not credit us with any. Now we have, we're really doing a lot more outreach, updating the ordinance. And as Joe Headley, our building inspector consultant, says, there have been more and more, but they will look at the number of ADUs that we've had and applications for them and those that have been processed to give us credit for our RENA numbers, the number that we assume could be the ADU credit for the, RENA credit by development of ADUs.
So we can get RENA credit for the ADUs that were just created in
Well,
this
and
past year.
saying this a different way, what they looked at previously is that they were not going to give us any allowable use of ADUs toward meeting our RENA because we didn't have any history of ADUs. Now we have some history of ADUs, but they will still be keeping us to a limit based upon how much we have actually been able to develop ADUs, etc. So it's going to be a little bit of a push of an argument that we have a certain number that we think we can achieve of ADUs and for the rationale that we have identified. I hope that's clear.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, great. And then one more question. What's our ability to rezone our commercial district? Like, so for instance, if someone who owns a building there wants to add on up top and put in some housing, are we able to do that?
Excuse me.
Yes.
Okay. And we didn't consider that before, did we, in the prior?
We looked at mixed use areas, but we didn't specify. And that's one of the questions I was sort of drawing out. Is there any other area in the map, if we can bring the map up, that that there could be housing units developed, such as increased density or mixed use, as a strategy to accommodate new housing units or develop more areas? We have some constraints, on the area of the city that's under the ALUC and the airport. So a lot of people have identified that area, but you really can't develop housing there within the certain areas of the flight path. But there, we did look and driving around, there are some opportunity sites, I would think, within the city, and I'm more than willing if there's any ideas that come up, just email me or email to Jeff or identify on a map right today. I'm happy to consider it and look at it.
Yeah,
Because-
great. I would definitely be interested in looking at our commercial site for.
There are a few more requirements under especially they just updated their land use inventory requirements for 6th cycle, and which we're going to just try and meet under our 5th cycle. So I have to look into that. It's not as simple as, we'll just identify this as available housing, and then you still have the issue of water. So.
Right. And then in terms of Site 1A and Site 1, I know we're talking to the Park District about Site 1A, and I'm interested in that being partly parkland. I think if we could do a little bit of, housing there and parkland, that would be great. But again, I feel like we need a whole visioning process to really understand what's going to go out in Fort Ord. So I'm still unsure about that, but those are my initial thoughts.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm hearing that really well from each of the council about Site 1A. And we also got a public comment from one of the Land Watch representatives that also said the same thing. Site 1A is a preferable site according to them. If, for the amount of property that we have there, it is quite frankly, you're able to meet most of the RENA just through development of that property. So we did have both sites in the former housing or your adopted housing element. But in terms of what you want to rezone, because remember the rezoning has to occur as part of this housing element update. That's really critical for it to be compliant. It is possible to just use Site 1A and the other elements that we've talked about today to see how we can move out some ADUs, etc. And to be able to state that you have the available land and that you've rezoned it, and using site 1A as that rezoning opportunity.
Okay.
I think that might be the most effective and maybe least controversial in terms of opposition to. Remember, we're having to do an EIR, and we went through a lawsuit all because of the rezoning of the former Fort Ord sites before. It is something we're going to have to challenge HCD on, though, and identify that these are the reasons why.
Okay. And then one last question. What's our deadline for this? When does this have to be done?
There's no deadline by the end of the year or anything like that for this.
Okay.
Because we're doing the update. We have that schedule that has us taking this out to the public and just moving it forward. I want to make sure we have enough public outreach, and that while we're doing this, we have the opportunity for any other cleanup, as I mentioned. So I don't want to necessarily rush it out the door and not have this chance. We've got LEAP and REAP grants that are paying for this, and the EIR. So I feel like our job is to make sure you get most bang for your buck.
Perfect.
But the schedule that I have, it takes us through, publication, HCD, 60-day review period, and environmental impact report review period and public review, and gets us through 2021 through that, and then adoption January, February, then of 2022, early 22, and then HCD has 60 days to make a letter saying we're compliant. By that time, we will know, because they'll have they work with us so closely.
Okay, great. And we would have completed the 5th and the 6th cycle at that point.
We completed the 5th, and then I'm trying to write it so that it is almost the 6th as well.
Okay.
Okay. But
Great.
remember, the 6th cycle's, 2024 to 2033 or something like that. So it's,
Okay.
I can't remember the dates, but.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for all of this information. I agree with Councilwoman Shirley. It's a lot. I just have a couple of comments and questions, so bear with me. Thank you for acknowledging the Land Watch letter. They also indicated 6 acres in Site 1A, and I'm wondering, do we have 6 acres identified? I've been hearing about the 6 acres for a while. Out of 18.5.
I think that we may have talked about 6 acres as flat area.
Okay.
But I have to actually.
And do you have a map that would show that?
We will for the housing element.
We could use.
Yeah, okay, so realistic capacity on page 3.5 of our existing housing element. We considered developable property of approximately 6 acres within the 18.5 acres, with a density of 16 to 18 units per acre to satisfy RHNA. And that's where that came from. It's in the site suitability inventory table 3.3.
Okay.
So we used our GIS mapping to do that, and we could prepare a more specific map on that. But that's how that came about. So I think that's the reference that Mike did, was basically using the adopted housing element.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to mention for the Planning Commission, while everybody's here, I'm going to a series of educational workshops that they're putting on, and this summer they will have Planning Commission trainings, as well as an updated Planning Commission guidebook. So I'll get that to our acting city manager to distribute accordingly. Fort Ord 247. So zoning. So thinking about plot 1, we know that only 100 acres in the middle of it is approved for housing. So do we zone it by segments?
Again, we would only be rezoning for RHNA numbers. So
Gotcha.
100 acres would be way too much, and would not be needed. I mean, there's and I would not suggest that. I think it's too large, and I think HCD has some requirements in terms of the amount of property. So we were really trying to keep to a level of specificity where you rezone to a certain size that will also accommodate the higher density, and that's what HCD likes to see. So we we hadn't identified a location in Site 1. Frankly, we looked at it more in terms of Site 1A in our previous document, and we'll see where it leads us now. I'm interested in seeing and hearing any comments about that.
My concern is the numbers I'm hearing is RENA numbers could go 3 to 4 times the number that we have now. And so 1A is not going to cut it.
But we're in 5th cycle. We do not have to accommodate six cycle at all. We are really still working on 5th cycle and 4th cycle carryover.
Okay.
So our numbers aren't going to change for this.
And so what I'm also hearing is we will rezone accordingly when development is presented to us for the Fort Ord property.
Yeah, with the years of working on that property for the city, and many times that has always been the assumption that a developer would come in, as they did in a decade ago or so, pay for the environmental document, pay for the studies, and pay for the rezoning application and subdivision, etc. And that would be done specific to a future development in a future property, not associated with the housing element at all.
Thank you. I also agree that we need to be really clean and clear on sites 2 and especially sites 3. I don't know if that was all gifted to us by the work family, how broad that gift was, but I want to make sure that we honor whatever agreements that we entered into so many years ago. I also agree. I'm really grateful that you took 17 acres out. That spot holds a special place for me, and I did not want to ever see that developed. The other thing that we had talked about previous about ADUs is the reason that they weren't going to require additional parking spots was if we were within a quarter mile of a bus stop. Did we ever confirm that that is yes, indeed? I don't know how many bus stops we have. I know there's a couple on Portola, but that would seem to, Denise?
I think that's an Alex question.
Okay.
I can tell you the legal requirement does not require parking in certain circumstances, but where certain bus stops and mass transit are, I don't know. We'd have to look at a map or something like that.
Okay, and then I just did a quick little search, and it's according to the ADU handbook by HCD, it says that there is no minimum lot size for the construction of a statewide exemption ADU. I didn't hear that. I heard that we were looking for particular parcels that could do this.
Yeah, I think the constraint would not be lot size. The constraint would be setbacks and that type of stuff. But lot size, the state has preempted and said there is no minimum. So I think last time we had minimum lot size, Denise can correct me if I'm wrong, of 7,500 square feet, and the state has come in and said no minimum lot size. So that really does open up quite a few more parcels this time around.
Gotcha. I also agree that the ADUs in the ordinance, we need to have some kind of a protection against short-term rentals. And I would also assume that there would be fines associated. I don't know how we track that, but I think it's very tempting to build something really beautiful and then make a whole lot more money renting it every night. So
that's right. They would be subject to our short-term rental ordinance, and the city has the ability to set and levy fines. And so I think that's part of the master fee schedule process. And if that was something that was the pleasure of the council, something we could definitely do is to really use fines to discourage the behavior that you described.
okay, thank you. And does anyone know, maybe Karen, Karen, do you know how many ADUs we currently have?
I think we have a few that are going through the process right now. I know for sure that 2 have gotten final inspections.
And both of which are on the south side? Yeah, south side?
Yes,
Okay. And I know of one house that was changed into a duplex on the north side?
correct.
Okay. And so those are the three that are?
Yes.
Okay, great. Just 100 acres, design, density bonus, housing elements, survey numbers, mixed use. The only other thing that I would, is just a comment, is I would love to ensure that all of the documents are available for the public after this meeting. So on that, let's go to the, I know Louise has her hand up, but I want to go to the Planning Commission first, and I'm just going to go in order of my screen. So I'm not doing alphabetical or status or anything. So let's start with George. You're muted.
I found the presentation a little bit disheartening or depressing because the city has it sounds like very little discretion. My biggest concern is parking. I know here on Rosita, if people don't park right onto the curb, you can't get two cars side by side. And as we get newer families coming into the city, which we have a few here, we're going to have children playing around. And a lot of the people don't even use their existing garage for their cars. And then if we get an ADU in there with a bedroom, that's a possibility of two people with two extra cars on the road. And so that's my big concern. And, if we deny somebody with state regulations, they can sue the city. That might be another problem that we will get into with our finances the way they are. So any event, I don't know if we will have discretion as far as traffic, and this parking would be concerned with traffic. And that would be obviously a police problem. That's the only biggest thing that I have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George. Mike.
Which Mike?
Oh, pardon me. Mike Hayworth.
Thank you. Good presentation. And I'm with George. Some of this is a little disheartening. It's just, especially at this point, because we don't know what direction it's going to go and what this is going to end up looking like. The first thing I had on my list also was parking. He talks about Rosita. Portola, sometimes if there's a car coming the other way, you have to pull off to let the car go by. So that's a big concern for me. I also am glad we took the 17 acres out. That to me is sort of a gateway to that whole area, and we get that development. I think that I think that would add to the, like I said, it gives it kind of a gateway look. The ease of approval, Scott mentioned that that's a concern for him. It's also a concern for me, and I think it's a burden for staff. I think we're putting a lot of subjective decisions for Karen. I know we're going to try and make it to be as clear for her as possible, but still, there's going to be questions, and it's going to end up being pretty subjective. And I think that's pretty tough for her. So I think that there probably needs to be a little more oversight with there. It's sounding to me like one of the things that might be able to limit this is water. Keeping that in mind. You had asked that one question that I was going to have about how many ADUs we have now, and got that. Mixed use is good, but I can't think of any buildings that right now would be suitable for that. I'm thinking the light industrial area we have down there would be the only kind of buildings that we have that are like that, and I don't know that any of them are suitable. And I think the 1A building there, I'm thinking remotely about the terrain there. It's pretty tough to build on, I guess. So you address that with only having 6 acres of that's developable, able to be developed. I guess that's really all I have to say at this point. The parking's a concern. Thank you. Good stuff.
Thanks, Mike. Perhaps we need a bike path through town. Sorry. Mr. Krieger.
All right. Just echo again, thanks for the presentations. And I think it was Councilman, member, excuse me, Shirley, that said, you know, we need to hear this more than once. I totally concur with that because it's, it takes a little bit for it to all stick. So thanks for bringing it back and going back over some of the stuff you've gone over before. A couple observations and some questions. Just one thought was, as we look at rezoning, whenever that we get to that, look and make sure we don't preclude stuff. That's a 30-foot height limit we have. The zoning for density, make sure we don't preclude stuff. I'm thinking particularly at the Planning Commissioners Academy, I was able to attend before the lockdown, give me an opportunity to, of course, Sacramento has a lot of the cutting edge stuff. They're really out there kind of showing us what can be done. And I remember I took some walks around town and went and looked at some of them. One of them that really stuck in my mind was one they were talking about was a micro unit. And I would never propose, we need, this one was like 7 or 8 stories tall. We don't need that. But it was, really neat. They had really put in a lot of housing, just a very small footprint. But it's because they had, they were able to go up and they built small units, and there's a real need for that. So just as we look at our rezoning, when we do get to that, let's make sure we don't inadvertently leave stuff in maybe that's going to cause a problem down the road. I do like the second to mixed use. I think I'm about to ask about this. I think it was like 3 years ago. United Way was at a council meeting giving a presentation, and it's come up a couple times since then. It just doesn't ever seem to get any traction. I think we talk about it and people go, yeah, that sounds good, but it'd be really nice to really try to dig into this. I do think there are opportunities perhaps, to see what the airport situation is within the light industrial, but it just seems like every time it comes up, it's like, oh yeah, great idea. And then, 6 months later, someone else brings it up. So I think, we need to get as many units as we can. And then we need to maybe really make sure we're not missing out there, because there might be something. I don't know if we can work with the United Way. I know a full-time person that was working on ADUs specifically, at least they did when they came and did this presentation. I'm assuming that person is still there. So maybe we could work with them and leverage some of their work to take some of the load off of us. So just something to think about as we're going through this.
Just to interrupt there, we did talk with them and use part of that analysis and part of our EDU, and that's definitely a resource.
Perfect. Okay, great. Good. That's good to know we're doing it. Because if they've already done work, maybe we, good. Let me know that. I would say you're right, Mayor, and other people, the stores. Obviously, we're leaving for San Diego tomorrow, and we always stay in Airbnb down there. And I know this because our friends that talk about this, all the ADUs are built all through San Diego, and they're stipulated not to be used for short-term rentals. I've stayed in one, and totally illegal. So yeah, people are gonna try. So you're right to be anticipating that, and you're gonna have to be aggressive, and because if they build it, people are gonna the money's gonna be too much. They're gonna start trying to rent it out, and we'll have to be really on our toes to when that problem does eventually crop up. Question, Denise, the RENA numbers, can we get credit for the RENA numbers for if we identify the land, even if we don't have the water, but it is coming like with the expansion of the Pure Water Monterey? Or is it no, you got to wait till you get the water and you get credit for it?
Great question. We need to be able to show that infrastructure can be delivered. But, with the Pure Water Monterey expansion project, which is also a project I've worked on for years, there's, if it can be shown it will be delivered within a certain amount of time, then yes, you can say that water would be available. So we did have that presentation with both Marina Coast Water District and Dave Stolt, Monterey Peninsula Water Management District, talked about timing, etc., and availability, and the type of water that's delivered under Marina Coast. I think the Monterey One water is still the potable, non-potable, highly
Right.
advanced treated.
Right.
So that's sort of the issue there. But I feel that it's something to think about. So
I was saying that I was looking on it, I'm saying about the ADUs in the existing Del Rio Oaks boundary, because Marina Coast says they have the water for the four-door development. So assuming that's, if we hang our hat on that, that's covered. But I was thinking about for the ADUs, because, in 2 years, 3 years, unless we hit a hiccup, there'll be enough water coming now to lift that CDO and start. And so it sounds like we might, at some point, get a little bit of lean into that and get some credit. So, okay, thank you. I was wondering about that. And the last thing was just, and this isn't exactly, this is more for staff, I guess. Thinking about the survey, we've talked about that a few times. I know it's coming. It'd be nice if there was if maybe the council or the planning commission gets a look at the questions before they go out. Excuse me. Surveys can be problematic sometimes, so it'd be nice to just get if one of the bodies could get a quick look at them before they go out, if that's possible. I don't know the timing constraints, but just a thought. All right, thank you.
Pardon
and
me.
just to be clear too, if I don't, Mayor, I'm sorry, just those questions that I was putting forth is the list that I've got that I'm trying to couple housing element questions on to the survey that Dave Zender is doing for economic, because I think it's an opportunity. So.
Thanks. All right, Bill Ragsdale Cronin.
Right.
Good evening. My first attempt at being somewhat of a planning commissioner after being appointed last week. Thanks, by the way, to the council for doing that. Denise, good working with you. We worked together a long time ago over at MRW, so it's nice to see you again. I got 3 questions. I don't necessarily need the answers right now, but it's something I'd like to see. You've mentioned that the garden center and the RV storage lots have water credits. I've been down on the RV lot, and I know there were 2 hose bibs for every parking spot, which kind of made it look like at one point you could actually hook your RV up. So if those are actually considered, there may be some water available down there. And then so that's on both of those parcels. And the other question I have is in the existing commercial district, and I don't know all my zones yet. I haven't done my homework well enough, but basically from the Moose Lodge to Stone Creek, that area, what part of that would be restricted for non-residential because of the airport, because of the landing or the runways or whatever configuration there? So if you could dig into that, I don't need the answer right now. It's fine. You can do that. And then a couple of comments. I've heard, we're worried about this and we're worried about that, and the state's taken a lot of discretion away from the city. The state did it because the cities were doing too much of not in my backyard, too much NIMBY. The state's going, wait a minute, you can't just say this, you can't say that. So they've laid out a fairly equal criteria for all the cities to have to abide by. We don't have to like it. Some of it I'm not a fan of, but the state has come in and basically said, you're not going to legislate this away at the city level anymore. So, let's see, that was one comment. Foreign properties moved to business. One of the thoughts that I had that I mentioned during my interview for planning commissioner was, and that's why I asked about the business district zoning, would be the possibility of moving the business district out to Fort Ord, since it's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, out in the weeds, and then do mixed use development in that area to create the downtown that a lot of people have wanted in Del Rio Oaks. And depending on how Fort Tag shakes out, you might actually have access to it from both sides of the canyon via bike lanes, walk lanes, and obviously driving. But the driving force now is to make more walking and bicycling communities versus driving. And then the last comment I got is when we're doing the short-term rental policy, especially addressing ADUs, it also needs to address the existing dwelling. Because I could certainly see a single person going, China, this nice 3-bedroom house, I'll build me an ADU, move into it, and I'll short-term my house. So you want to make sure it covers both sides of it. Because like Gary was saying, yeah, they build ADUs and they rent them out. Well, what would stop me from building an ADU, moving Susan and I into it, and they're renting out my 3-bedroom, 2-bath house on short-term? So I think we need to cover both sides of that. Other than that, I think that covers everything I needed to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Michael Berger.
Hello, everyone. Great presentation. Appreciate all the work that's gone into it, and I do like hearing it a second time. Pardon me. It really does help. There is a lot to absorb. So thank you very much for your time. I know Fort Ord is a long way out, but something to consider when we solicit a developer. A percentage of the housing should be required to have ADU units per the plan, and that's something that the developer needs to have presented to them. And we could do what's happening in Los Angeles, Southern California, where they're building shopping centers with residential, whether it's low income or what have you, on top of the shopping center. That could be a requirement as well when we ask for bids. And I think those are some things that we can consider as satisfying a lot of the requirements when we look at this. Those are the things that I just see that would be a way to address our shortcomings.
Is that it, Michael?
That's it.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy?
Thank you. Well, the good thing about going last is most questions have already been addressed and or answered. Checking them all off my list as I've gone along. I have a couple more. First of all, thank you, Denise Duffy and City Attorney Lorca for very comprehensive and informative review and presentations. I have just a couple questions remaining, a couple of repeats too. Either of you can field them as you feel appropriate. Ms. Duffy, thank you for bringing attention to and putting emphasis on the reality of ADUs being a strong component, infill in meeting our inability, as it were, to meet our RHNA numbers, it seems, which leads me to think in the direction of rezoning. Most immediately agreed with a couple of the other council members. Site 1A, and with the considerations mentioned also, somewhere near around the 6 acres that are recommended, while lending strong consideration to preserving open space and green space. So ADUs altogether, I think that we're looking at this number as an ideal number, as a maximum possible number. We're identifying available sites. Now we can see that number is the largest. Now of those available sites, there will be a lesser number of people who have the desire to develop an ADU. Furthermore, of those that would like to, there will be an even lesser number that have the ability to, the resources to. And so that seems to me to be a diminutive projection of sorts. So I'm pleased to see that we are conservatively looking in the direction of mindful development along those lines. Another thing, so far as ADUs, and Alex didn't mention it, as far as the legalities, but I have read somewhere, and I'm fairly well versed as I've just completed building one not too long ago, and I'm delving into another one here shortly. There is, I've heard, certain amnesty granted for existing ADUs. I can go all throughout our city and I can see granny units, attached ADUs. Now, how forthcoming our residents will be to be transparent about the use of their homes and help us count towards those numbers is one thing. I'm wondering if that might need to be addressed through some level of enforcement, something to think of as things progress. Let's not say enforcement, maybe encouragement. But that's all I have to say. Oh, so far as the ADUs, junior ADUs in particular, relative to enlarging or adding onto a home, I do see a lot of questions asked there in the future. If it's a square footage or a setback thing, why for an ADU and why not for a remodel? Well, quite simply because one is one and one is the other. Detached ADUs are fairly self-explanatory. It might get a little tricky with the junior ADUs. They are required to have an exterior entrance. However, they have a thoroughfare into the main house for shared facilities. But there'll just have to be guidelines and additional scrutiny applied there, but I'm sure we can get through that. This one particularly for Ms. Duffy. I had the same question Councilmember Shirley did concerning deadlines. You stated that there were none. However, I have heard of some municipalities there's certain litigation, being fined or sued by the state of California in the past. Presumably they were really combative, maybe a stick in the mud. I realize that there's some wiggle room there throughout the process, so long as we're demonstrating intent and we're moving forward. But is there a point where we've actually got to get the shovel in the ground, break ground, and show that we've signed an agreement with a developer and that a project is actually underway? Is there a point that we absolutely need to get to sooner than later, or at a specific time, if any? And would there be any foreseeable financial impact or concerns for the city, if not?
Mayor, may I answer that one? I think I want to clarify. I shouldn't have said there are none because we're in the 5th cycle and the goal is to get a compliant housing element. But there's two sort of separate lines that you just talked about. One is housing element deadline schedule, and then the other is, do you have to have a development rezone in place by a certain time? So the first one, if you don't have a compliant housing element, HCD has enforcement opportunities. And so I think, as long as, and they've been very good, as long as you're progressing forward. But we do want to have a housing element that meets, that is adopted by the city for 5th cycle. And then we hope that it becomes compliant. So I think our schedule overall to get that done by, first quarter 2022 is a really good one. The second component of what you talked about is essentially about development. It's important to mention that we did a lot in our last housing element review process and approval, is that housing elements don't require you to approve a development or get a house built. There actually is no requirement for any homes to be built, but you have to approve a housing element. And in our case, you have to rezone enough land to and find enough land that sites available for meeting the RHNA. So we have a deadline. By the time we adopt our housing element, we need to shortly thereafter, within a month or at the same time, approve a rezoning for whatever sites that we've determined to be for residential. No, there isn't anything that is specific to the former Fort Ord that I can think of that has a deadline to it, other than it's kind of a first come, first serve in some situations in terms of resources or infrastructure, water. Alex, am I correct in that? And I'd like to add anything to that?
No, nothing to add. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Duffy. And I'd also like to touch on something in Alex's presentation, considering the short-term rental or the use of ADUs. To me, the streamlined ministerial non-review process with very few constraints, considering ADUs, is an answer to California's affordable housing crisis. And they absolutely should not be utilized just as short-term rental and additional income generating units for a household. So you had mentioned that there is a 30-day minimum for a rental rather than a weekend or whatnot. I would like to propose that through our ordinances, and I know that you're bringing a draft to the Planning Commission, as you mentioned, but I would like to outstretch that as far as is legally possible, not in perpetuity, but something lengthy to where, someone can sign a lease and stay for 6 months or a year. But to the homeowner, I would say that almost that they who apply for and are granted an ADU almost relinquish their right to turn either the ADU or the primary residence into a short-term rental, because there are ways to circumvent the law, as Commissioner Ragsdale Cronin had brought up, and I agree. So I really think that should be addressed in the ordinance also, and then somehow regulated through the issuance of short-term rental permits. And so thank you again for your presentation. I'm looking for subsequent informative meetings. What's brought to the Planning Commission by Alex next month. And everything else we have had a deep dive and a good talk about. So I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Is Denise with us? Is she under a different name?
If I may, she contacted me via email. She is joyfully floating about on Lake Shasta right now on a houseboat with limited reception. She apologizes she was not able to attend. She will review the video and join us next month.
Okay, thank you. So I believe I hit all the commissioners, correct? I didn't miss anyone?
Yes.
Okay, so let's go out to the public. Louise has been waiting very patiently.
Thank you very much. I'd like to apologize for not responding to your chat, Madam Mayor. For some reason, my chat is disabled and I couldn't do that, and let you know that you would acknowledge my hand up. My question was addressed by Commissioner Ragsdale Cronin. I would like to see a map showing the airport restricted areas and how far out they go, and do they not only, obviously to some extent, they probably impact part, if not all, of our light industrial area off of Calle del Oaks, but do they extend eastward into any of the areas that is the Fort Ord property? But a map showing how much of the light industrial area is impacted within the briefings would help, and in our presentation to the state would help the state understand why we cannot consider putting housing in a certain area. I am fully supportive of, if we could make that, encourage the light industrial area to go into the Fort Ord properties that are not suitable for homes, and to make a downtown area with, if possible, at least a partially upstairs apartments. So mixed use downtown area. But again, having some kind of visual of exactly what the restrictions are. There's height restrictions, there's types of business restrictions or residential restrictions, exactly what the restrictions are in that property, I think would help everybody understand why we can't consider those. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. Pat, I'm still out to the public. I'll call on you when we come back. Any other public comment? Seeing none, let's go back to Ms. Lintel. You're muted.
There. Alex, thank you for your presentation. It was very informative and I appreciate it, as well as Denise's. Is there any lowering of restrictions on, say, or raising the height restrictions for ADUs, within the community, or do we still have to abide by the same height restrictions? And also for new units?
Off the top of my head, Councilmember Lintel, so don't hold me to it, but I think there's the ability to limit height, but the lowest we can do is 16 feet. I would have to go back and look. but that's my recollection from the state handbook.
Okay, so we could go 30 feet?
Yeah, as long, yeah, I think 16, again, don't hold me to this, but I think 16 feet is the lower limit on that. Let's see if I have it handy here. Hang on. Let's see.
That's okay, you can get
Okay.
back to us.
All right.
But thanks again for both of you for your great presentations.
Okay. So any other council or planning commission last minute thoughts or ideas? I'm not seeing any hands. So I just want to say thank you again to Denise and Alex for doing all this work and the work that's involved in it. And I want to say, I think we should have more combined meetings, especially as we move forward with not only housing elements, but also all the other things that are going to come before us. So I look forward to doing this again. So acting city manager, any last minute?
No, thank you. We'll be working with Denise and with Alex to move the components of all these components forward and getting you the information that you talked about and integrating your feedback in this process as well. So thank you.
Denise, Alex, any last minute? Anything we didn't hit for you?
No, just thank you for your time.
Okay.
Ditto. Thank you. It was really helpful. Thank you.
Louise, did you have another?
Yeah, I just I neglected to really thank both Denise and Alex for their great presentations, and I wanted to emphasize that. I greatly enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. Well, on that, we are adjourned. Thank you all for sharing your evening with us this evening. All right.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
At all.